The seaplane jolted as the observer released the 112-pound bomb from the rack underneath the plane's fuselage. Immediately, both pilot and observer leaned over the side of the plane to see the result. The bomb landed some 6 feet from the submarine's hull, a miss. Moments later, an explosion sent a vast column of water into the air, rocking the small seaplane 1,000 feet above. The submarine's stern momentarily heaved out of the water before another plume of water, this time containing oil and debris, rose from the surface. Just a few minutes earlier, the seaplane had been patrolling a convoy of 10 ships, circling above as the convoy made its way up the channel. Suddenly, a white streak of foam was seen approaching one of the ships. The observer yanked on the pilot's head, an instruction for him to turn the plane for a better view. A torpedo was speeding towards the ship. Immediately, the pilot fired a red flare to warn the ship, whilst the observer grabbed his camera. Just in time, the ship turned enough for the torpedo to miss its target, if only by a few feet. The seaplane gave chase. The observer was 27-year-old Lieutenant Bernard Dangerfield, and the pilot was Second Lieutenant Edward Ackery, who had just celebrated his 19th birthday the day before. It was the 7th of July 1918, and both men were posted to the Marine Operations Seaplane Station of RAF 242 Squadron, based at Newhaven. The men radioed back to base and continued to circle, watching as a number of patrol craft and even a friendly airship appeared. They continued their patrol until they were low on fuel, returning to a hero's welcome at the station. For whatever reason, they weren't awarded a kill, which would have meant a financial bonus for this crew of 2, despite a large oil slick being visible in the area for a number of days. This would turn out to be the closest encounter men of Newhaven Seaplane Station would have with a submarine. From the start of the First World War, Germany had pursued an effective U-boat campaign against merchant shipping. The main purpose was to stop the supply of food into Britain and the supply of munitions, men and stores headed for the front. Initially, they obeyed prize rules, which meant they would surface before attacking a merchant ship to ensure the safety of passengers and crew. However, at the end of 1914, Britain introduced Q ships, armed ships disguised as merchant vessels intended to lure and destroy U-boats. This led Germany to declare the waters around the British Isles a war zone on the 4th of February 1915. This continued until the 4th of May 1916, when the Germans signed the Sussex Pledge. The SS Sussex was one of 7 ferries which had been on the cross-channel service between Newhaven and Dieppe. When war broke out, she was transferred to run out of Folkestone, together with many of her Newhaven crew. On the 24th of March 1916, she set sail from Boulogne with 386 passengers, including some Americans, 1,200 bags of mail, and a crew of 53. Not far from Boulogne, and without warning, she was torpedoed by the German submarine UB-29. The explosion and resultant panic led to 50 deaths. In order to appease the Americans, who hadn't entered the war at this stage, the Germans signed the Sussex Pledge, a promise not to target passenger or merchant ships unless the presence of weapons had been established, in which case they would not sink the ship without first ensuring the safety of passengers and crew. This remained in place until the 1st of February 1917, when Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. Seaplane stations were reasonably new, and only 2, Calshot and Westgate, were operational on the south coast when the war began. As the war progressed, more bases were added to provide additional patrolling and anti-submarine capacity. Once the Germans announced unrestricted submarine warfare, a further 6 stations were opened, including Newhaven in May 1917. This now provided an effective chain of stations patrolling the south coast from Tresco in the Scilly Isles to Westgate in Kent. By the end of the war, there were 26 seaplane stations around the British Isles. Newhaven was one of the major supply ports to the Western Front, supplying food, stores and munitions to the troops in France. It could therefore be argued that it was, at least from the German perspective, a legitimate target. To try and overcome the threat, the shipping from Newhaven travelled in convoys, supported by destroyers, torpedo boats and minesweepers. But aircraft had the advantage over shipping. They were able to spot a U-boat further away than any accompanying ship and could cover greater distances at greater speed. Even underwater, the U-boats could detect the sound of a seaplane's engine on their hydrophone, so seaplanes also acted as a deterrent. Lieutenant Ackery, posted to Newhaven Seaplane Station in 1918, explains that German submarines seldom attacked ships escorted by aircraft. They had a highly exaggerated opinion of the effect and accuracy of our puny bomb load of one 112 and one 50-pounder. Despite these precautions, 9 of the 10 transports remembered on Newhaven Transport Memorial were lost as a direct result of U-boat action. This photograph of a ship that had just been torpedoed shows how dangerous it really was. And this is just 5 minutes later. The seaplane station at Newhaven was initially under the control of the Royal Naval Air Service before it was merged with the Royal Flying Corps to become the RAF on the 1st of April 1918. The station itself occupied 5 acres, with another 6 acres used for drilling. Added to this were some hired buildings at tide mills. A double-fronted wooden seaplane shed, measuring 120 by 50 foot, was built on a concrete hard standing called by courtesy of its naval roots, the quarterdeck. There was a wooden slipway leading down to the sea and additional buildings including a pigeon loft, women's restroom, men's baths, a drying room and an armoury and bomb store. 3 old railway carriages were used as offices, an ammunition store and crew room, and there was also a wireless and telegraphy hut. The men lived in wooden army huts built on piles to avoid flooding, while the officers were billeted at tide mills and Bishopstone. The officers' mess was located in the tide mill. When Lieutenant Ackery arrived, he was just 18 and, in the eyes of the RAF, a child until he reached his 19th birthday. This, however, had its advantages, as he was entitled to extra rations. He described the food as good, as they drew rations from a Canadian supply base where standards were above normal. In 1918, the station was extended to include a larger seaplane shed for repairing aircraft, together with an attached workshop. The wooden slipway was replaced by 2 concrete ones, which ran down to the sea, although did not reach it at low tide. When fully operational, the station employed 194 staff, including 17 women in uniform and 17 female household staff. The women had a variety of roles which were divided into 4 main groups: clerks and store women, with shorthand typists being paid the most, household, who were paid the least but worked the longest hours, technical and non-technical. Most of the women at Newhaven were clerical workers, but on a seaplane station they could also have worked as riggers, air mechanics or pigeon keepers. Launching a seaplane took a lot of effort from a great number of men. First, the seaplane had to be brought from its shed, its wings unfolded and the wires and bolts made secure. This was done by the riggers under the watchful eye of the chief mechanic. To get the plane into the water, it had to be placed on a 2-wheeled trolley by the handling crew. Being slightly tail-heavy, the tail was then rested on a trestle so that the bombs and other equipment could be loaded, including a Lewis machine gun mounted in the rear cockpit and a wireless radio which was placed under the observer's seat. The armourer and his men loaded the bombs onto a rack on the underside of the fuselage. The maximum load was one 112-pound bomb and 2 50-pound bombs. However, the actual load carried depended on the condition of the seaplane. The seaplane's wings were made of canvas stretched over wooden frames, so if it was new or had recently been re-rigged, it might just take a full load. However, as the fabric began to slacken, the load would have to be lightened. Ackery remembered how first the bombs would be released, starting with the smaller ones, until even the machine gun, for protection against non-existent enemy aircraft, was ditched and they flew with just a revolver. Luckily, U-boats couldn't distinguish whether or not the seaplane was armed. The armourer and observer would then check the bomb sights and the bomb dropping gear. More equipment was added, including a very light pistol and flares for signalling, ammunition pans for the Lewis gun, a camera and slides, a revolver, a signalling lamp, life belts, emergency rations, and finally, a box containing 2 pigeons. Because the radio wasn't always reliable, the pigeons provided a backup. The observer carried a small notepad provided by the pigeon service on which they wrote their messages, which would then be placed in a small aluminium tube and attached to the bird's leg. Lieutenant Press explained that the birds were often sleepy, having been settled in their box for 3 or 4 hours, and took a poor view to flying, often settling on the plane's wingtip well out of reach. Press would then throw Lewis machine gun rounds at the bird to encourage it to fly off, being careful not to hit the bird that might save them. There was a knack to releasing the pigeon to prevent it from hitting the tailplane. Ackery explains how we covered the bird's wings with our hands and flung them hard downwards and forwards. Once all the paraphernalia had been loaded, which for Lieutenant Dangerfield included his fishing rod to while away the hours if they had a forced landing, the crew made ready to move the plane. They lifted the tail from the trestle and pushed the plane on its trolley to the top of the slipway. From here a winch was attached and the plane lowered down the slipway until it was a few feet away from the water's edge. Next, the armourer took out the bomb's safety pins and passed them to the observer. This would be used as evidence that the correct procedure had taken place should the bombs fail to explode. Finally, the pilot would turn the engine over to warm it up. When ready, he indicated to the ground crew to congregate around the tail whilst the engine was opened up to full power. Ackery describes how the poor ground crew grew to twice their normal size as the slipstream ballooned their overalls and coats. The seaplane was then winched down into the water until the main floats took the weight of the plane. The winch was then released and the plane floated away. Takeoff was tricky and the conditions had to be just right. A calm, flat sea meant that the seaplanes could not ride up onto the heels of their floats to take off. With a glassy sea, the seaplane stuck to the water, and Lieutenant Press explains how it was quite normal for the observer to climb out onto the port wing to take some of the weight off the tail in order that it could rise. He would then climb back into the rear cockpit once the plane was airborne. If the sea was rough, the planes could surf along the crest of a wave, although this was difficult and a wing could be damaged if the plane slipped off. Ackery described how there was something tremendously exciting about scudding along the crest of a 5 or 6 foot high wave. From his position in the cockpit, the pilot had very little visibility, so it was the observer's role to guide him. But communication was difficult due to the noise of the aircraft and the wind. To overcome this, the observer would stand up behind the pilot, place his hand on the pilot's head and turn it gently left or right to indicate the direction he was to fly in. However, in the excitement of action, this technique was not always as gentle as it might be. Ackery explains how his head could be forced hard left or right with such violence that he could only just maintain track through the corners of his eyes. Ackery's last patrol took place on the 29th of October 1918, and a few days later he was told that there were no more German submarines in the Channel and that consequently there was no need for patrols. He was demobilised on the 17th of April 1919. The station officially closed in May 1919 and the buildings were auctioned off in the 1920s. The wooden hangar was relocated to the East Quay, where it was used as a bonded wine warehouse. It was completely destroyed by fire in 1961. The larger shed was used to manufacture the 50-foot concrete piles which replaced the rotting ones in the harbour. You can still see one on the beach with its date marked on its side. The shed was sold in 1921 to the London and South Western Railway and relocated to Wimbledon. Since March 2013, it has been used by Firecracker Works Limited for designing and creating sets for private and corporate events. The concrete bases of the Seaplane sheds are still visible on the beach and are occasionally used as a helicopter landing pad by the local Coast Guard.